back here in this capacity is great. Also, Dave Tuttle, hope you're feeling better. Dave Rubin, nice to see you. Eric Bickle, an old friend from SDG, nice to see your name in the audience. So I'm going to talk today about, as the title says, accelerating the energy transition. I'm going to begin with some sort of background about General Motors, and hopefully it will not be, well, we'll get to in a second. Then I'm going to talk about the energy transition and sort of what that means. And the last section is going to be about sort of what it means to manage it internally to General Motors, or how it, what's happening inside the beast. All right, so a section about GM. So what is true and is really kind of surprising is that the auto industry really is changing more now than it has in the past 50 years. Let me say, I'm not one for just sort of passing on corporate hype or drivel. But what is going on in GM and the other auto companies too, it's not just General Motors, it really is a profound change. The movement to electrification, as well as changes in mobility and mobility patterns and micromobility, is resulting in sort of profound changes in the way we do business and how we do business and what we produce. Okay. All right. So corporate mission statements tend to be really have sort of zero information content. This one is actually has a lot of reality behind it. And the vision is to create this world with zero crashes, zero emissions, and zero congestion. When GM first published this a few years ago, nobody paid attention, which is usually the appropriate response when a major corporation redoes its mission statement. But since then, the sort of outside world has caught on to what's going inside the company and sort of gets the seriousness of what it is that we are doing and trying to do. We have a bunch of partnerships that we've never had before. I'm sure probably all of you, well, I don't know if that's true or not, know about Cruise, which is our autonomous vehicle unit that we first bought, and then we kept off in its, quite wisely, in its own world, so it wasn't get sort of inundated by the huge mothership. And at that time, Honda and now Microsoft and Walmart and other sort of partners on that, LG Chem is a really important partner for producing our propulsion systems. And EVgo, we've just announced sort of a major partnership for infrastructure. All right, well, who cares about decarbonization and why? My guess is for this audience, I don't have to elaborate too much. But the answer is kind of a lot of people, investors care. There's been a tremendous amount in the news. It just sort of escalates about the importance investors place on this. There's now actually a kind of interesting backlash that it's become so faddish that there's a strong need to make sure that you're not greenwashing. And there's all sorts of interesting events happening in the regulatory environment as well as in business climate against the greenwashing. Customers clearly care across the, really not everywhere the same, but very, very large portions of customers care that had not in the past. The new hires really care. So GM's interesting in this way in that it is, I think, 60 to 70% of the people that work in the company have been there less than 5 years. I joined GM about 5 years ago, but I rejoined. I also was an employee there in the 80s and then consulted for many years in between before coming back as a full-time employee. And the whole profile and demographic structure of the company has really profoundly changed. And it matters. And there is a big generational difference in how people care about it. And NGOs obviously care a lot. So one thing that's very real and that I think people outside the company don't get is that GM has really bet the company on electrification. That if we've gotten this wrong, we are in deep trouble because the company really has gone in. There's been this massive change in the product portfolio. There's been a huge commitment of capital. There's been a huge commitment of engineering resources, and people, we sort of branched, we've gone out on this journey, and it is kind of irrevocable at this point. That's not as visible from the outside as it is on the inside, but it's a really big deal. Okay. So if this goes wrong, there'll be a second bankruptcy, and this time I don't believe anybody will bail out the company. Okay. So let me talk about the role of electrification in reducing emissions, because that's sort of foundational to everything that we are doing. Okay. First, electricity markets are going to really evolve in the next 10 years in ways that are only kind of now being understood. And even now, it's clearly, I mean, it's, in one sense, we're going into this brave new world that's sort of an undiscovered country, and we just trying to understand it. And it's, you think you understand it, but then you realize you don't. And so what I've tried to do is sort of characterize here sort of 5 different categories, 5 different ways in which, let me see if this works. Let's try this. Sort of how the world of electricity markets are changing. First, in terms of electricity flow, well, in the old world, it was electricity came from the utility to the customer. In today, which is what we call demand response, or today-ish, same thing. Distributed energy resources, and this is the sort of underlies so much of what we're going to talk about. Energy will flow 2 ways. Will flow from the customer, from electric vehicles back into the grid, as well as from the power companies into the customer. So what's the role? That means there's a big difference in the change of the customers and what the role is. In the old world, in the jargon of the utility companies, customers are load. In other words, it's just people that consume electricity. In demand response, it's controlled load. So this is the need to have more control over when and how much people consume. Under the world we're going to, their load plus their generators. Okay? So they're both consumers and producers. And along with that is a change in how money flows. In the old world, money flowed, I should have reversed those arrows, money flowed to the utilities from the customer. In demand response, it's a slight reverse. Some of the money actually flows to the customers. Okay. In the world of distributed energy, the money flowing to the customers will be much more, potentially much more. Okay. And then there's a question of control. So, and the issue is who controls electricity consumption. Now, Texas is as everybody knows, and I think in this room, the most deregulated market, electricity market in the country, which up until fairly recently was seen as being a great asset. And now people are debating that one way or another. My point of view on that is that, the freeness of the market is mostly an asset, but obviously needs to be put under some control. But if you look at the role of the customer versus the utility, in the old world, the utility had all the power. In demand response, there's more power to the customer. And in the world of distributed energy resources, there's more power still. And so then you just question, what's the role of the vehicle? And that's what's key to General Motors. Well, in the old world, it had none. In demand response world, it's an appliance. It's just part of load. It's like a toaster. Well, in distributed energy resources, it is a producer of energy. Okay. You've probably read the emissions work in companies like Google, which is, in my mind, absolutely leading edge, and certainly I think the leader in how they're trying to green their emissions. But in one sense, their problem is much easier than General Motors because they're really working just with data centers. And it is a huge problem in the amount of electricity they consume. But the profile of GM and say the other OEMs really matches the US as a whole. So kind of a much more comprehensive solution is required. Anyway, enough on that. Just a quick notice, the public is clearly willing to regulate CO2. This map is an estimate of the adults who support regulating CO2 as a pollutant in 2020. And today, about 25% of the adult population support regulating it. And in every county of the US, at least 50% support regulating CO2, even if you will, in the most red of counties. I don't know if you're familiar with the Six America study that Yale George Mason do, and they've done sort of annual studies on public concerns on global warming, and they have these wonderful sort of 6 segments. And on one hand, you have the alarmed, and these are people that care and are willing to pay for it. Then there are the concerned, which are people who care about it, but they're not really willing to pay for it. The cautious, people who actually couldn't care less, the disengaged. The doubtful, and then I don't know about global warming. And the dismissive, and the people who are dismissive, they hate the subject. They just absolutely despise the whole subject. Okay. Well, 5 years ago, and this is just 5 years ago, those dismissive kind of matched those that were alarmed. What you've seen today is that the alarmed has gone from about 11% to 26%, 2.5 times what it was. And the concern plus the alarms, like more than half the population of the US. The dismissives have shrunk down to 11%. The doubtful have become much less too. And we've had this mass swing here. And this trend, in my mind and in many others, is just going to continue. And then this group, especially the alarmed, are going to act on their convictions. So even without everything else, GM needs to find a way to net zero emissions, okay, due to charging and due to everything else that it's doing. So GM's actually been a leader in many ways in greening its own operations. It has now a really actually good reputation amongst the NGOs, and it's reduced its energy intensity by 20%. It's had a great reduction in carbon. It's reduced water intensity by 15%. And these factors are very real, and they're just going to continue. So I want to move on now to where are the vehicle-based energy services going to be over the next decade. Hold on a second here. Let me go here. Okay. And this is sort of a key chart, a cartoon that we've used at GM to help explain to our people inside what this stuff about energy services is all about and where are the opportunities in electrification and why. So the blue line is the world today, and you have load coming in through a meter that then comes into a panel, that then comes into maybe an EVSC, and then goes to the thermostat, to appliances, into a vehicle. Okay. In the world that's coming, and this is probably in the world of between 2025 and 2030, but we'll start right away, you have this yellow line, this orange line, excuse me, where you have energy coming out of the vehicle. It will go through this bidirectional EVSE, go through the panel, and then can either go to power the home or business, or will go outside through the meter and then go into an aggregator, because no individual house will be able to provide enough load or certainty that would interest an energy company, and then be powered out into the grid. And power, it's the power companies' needs that create the value. And the number one and most important is renewable integration. And the fact that renewables are intermittent, happen at one time a day, and it's different than the time of consumption, but also load curtailment, peak shifting, capacity avoidance, ancillary services, resiliency, and a number of other values. Okay. Well, the sources of value then are the ability to sort of broker load. How do I, hold on a second. I'm just going to do it this way. Okay. One is to broker load. We're actually doing a little experiment right now that I'll talk about very briefly. Load management, which is V1G or demand response programs, that's going on right now. And that is the controlled load that a lot of utility companies are now working with GM and other OEMs on. Okay. Then the big piece here, the big piece in electrification is the V to G to V to H. I don't have any numbers here, but this is about 3/4. Okay. Then load aggregation right here is another source of value. And another piece, and I'll talk about each of these in turn, is carbon credits that would accrue from V to G load management. And I'll talk about that in a second. Now, we think we're in a pretty good position to enable this value through our multiple energy technologies, and that includes our EVs, fuel cells, stationary storage, electrolyzers, and a large base of customers, suppliers, and dealers. Okay.
Rob, can you just spell out V to G and V to H?
Oh, I apologize. Yes, if I use, I am sorry. Yes, V to G means vehicle to grid. Vehicle to V to H means vehicle to home. And V1G means just vehicle, just means power just from the grid to the vehicle. It's not exactly a consistent acronym, but that's the convention. Okay, my apologies. Thank you for stopping me. Okay. Okay. So you might ask in grid energy services, what is even GM's right to win? Okay. Who are we to play in this area? And we think we have a right to play, at least, if not necessarily a right to win, because so much of this is going to be centered around the vehicle, and we'll have first crack at the customer. But even more important is that we will be able to, it's going to be absolutely critical to make this experience easy and simple for the customer, which means embedding it within the controls of the vehicle and the apps that control the vehicle that's on the owner's mobile devices. Okay. And that's a huge effort within the company. And we're working furiously on this to make this work. And what's really different and that's challenging the company is that in order to do this well, you have to integrate the vehicle, the user experience, and this is what's truly new, the grid, into a seamless experience. So in other words, utilities will have different rules about when you can charge and can't charge and what their incentives are. There are like 3,000 utilities in the country, and each one, there'll be a tremendous amount of differences. Well, all that has to be managed for the customer because nobody's going to mess around with it for the dollars that are at stake. Okay. EVs, we think our EVs plus stationary storage systems plus financial services plus our large installed base of customers is a really strong foundation for energy service offerings to retail and commercial industrial customers. Okay, but this is a right to win. It's not a license to win. And it will be a fight, and it'll be a fight with both old and new competitors. Okay. These services as we electrify, will roll out over time. Right now, you can do broker load. Load management is really right where we are, and we're kind of right here. Okay. Using the vehicle to power the home directly and for resiliency will clearly be the first application. It is the most straightforward. It doesn't require much change in the regulatory environment. It doesn't require much new technology. It does require some. Rolling out, following it by a few years, will be vehicle to grid. And the reason this will lag a few years is because the regulatory environment really doesn't currently permit it or enable it, although there's huge momentum within the regulatory environment to make this happen. And we think it's inevitable that, given the value at stake, that this will happen. And then aggregation and the carbon credits. I'm going to talk about that. Will follow the last, and I'll talk about that later. But we see all these things rolling in around 2030. It's not the uniform opinion. Some people think it'll come faster. Others think it'll be 2040, 2050. I think it'll probably come faster sooner than later. I think this really reminds me of what Bill Gates said. We kind of underestimate what's going to happen in 2 years. We overestimate what's going to happen in 2 years and underestimate what's going to happen in 10. I just want to talk about two of the sources of value from electrification that are kind of important to understand, and probably two of the biggest. And the first on the left is load shifting. And so what you have in the blue line is the load over hours of the day, the 24 hours of the day, from starting 7 in the morning. And you see the sort of big peak in here. When is that? About 1930. So 6:30 in the evening. And what this causes is capacity to meet this peak here is a real problem in a variety of ways, both from a cost and greenhouse gas emissions. So one is to figure out how to use the electrified vehicles to sort of shift load. And we're working on 3 pilots on that right now. And then the other piece is electricity load by time of day is load curtailment. So this blue line is a sort of normal load, but then sometimes, and as you all unfortunately just discovered very recently, you can have this huge spike in load due usually to weather events. Well, anyway, between sheets of the converted, you know what kind of chaos that can cause. Well, I think somebody did the calculation that if the fleet had been electrified, okay, you would never have, the grid would never have gone down because of the resiliency that was provided in the electric vehicles. Okay. Now, GM's already begun managing the grid to increase its sustainability and economic value for its customers, its suppliers, itself. We have solar and wind farms that we buy virtually through power purchase agreements, which are agreements to buy the energy. And this has let General Motors sort of green almost its entire energy consumption for manufacturing operations. Really big deal. And it's actually kind of interesting because GM has such a huge load requirement. We can actually do this profitably through these forward purchase agreements, because we can usually buy the energy, the clean energy, at a price that's below its expected value because we buy so much of it. So it's kind of one of those nice things how the economics and the sustainability all go hand in hand. We're now looking very hard at solar and wind PPAs for scope 3 emissions. And scope 3 emissions means from charging for our suppliers and for our customers. Okay. We're doing a project now that it's probably premature for me to talk about, but it's going to be announced in a month or two, where we're going to permit households in Texas that own an ICE vehicle to get inexpensive 100% green electricity. And it's going to be co-branded with Shell, who's a big partner. of GM's. And we're going to do the same thing to see if we can also get our suppliers to green their energy. And this will be a big deal in that it's an example of how a company like General Motors, and it's an advantage that Tesla doesn't have, because we can bring a large installed base of customers, we can get really good deals on energy that they would not be able to get themselves. So it presents this great win-win opportunity with energy providers. We do this with our internal combustion engine vehicles. So it's the kind of thing when you see it, it's pretty easy, but we're pretty excited about it. It's sort of a new way of doing business. Okay.
Hey, Rob, there's one question, and it's from maybe 2 slides ago. First one question, ICE is internal combustion engine.
Yes.
One of the questions
I did it again, sorry.
But, no, it's okay. But the other question is, talking about the power purchase agreements, PPAs, and so expanding on, essentially having, let's just say 100% renewable electricity to your facilities. How much is GM thinking about, solar or storage on property that you own versus just purchasing from the grid? Is there a particular plan there?
So we go back and forth about this, and so the solar is now actually most efficient when it's at utility scale rather than at rooftop scale. And I just don't think you can put solar on roofs to produce with the efficiency that you could with utility scale solar. Early on, there were many pilots that had rooftop solar with our dealers and also in our factories and in our other facilities. But I think now the movement is for utility scale solar and wind. Okay. Did that answer the question, Carrie?
Yeah, I think that's fine. We could have more discussion later, perhaps, but that's good.
Okay. So I want to talk about one thing that's, it sounds kind of duller. It's duller in dishwater, but it's really important. And that is being able to know how much greenhouse gas you're putting into the system at any given time of day by your consumption of electricity. This is a chart of daily, what they call emissions factors, which is the metric tons of CO2 per hour by time of day for select days in California. And it's for 4 different days. And what you see is there's a 4 times difference between the daily high and low. That's a really, really large difference. And if what you're trying to do is understand sort of how much carbon you have to offset and when you have to do it, and when your consumption is a problem versus when it's not a problem, you have to understand these patterns and how it changes. And you have to do the tracking at a level that's, I think, on the order of 15 minutes, certainly no more than an hour interval, in order to get to the kind of control that we're going to need to have, both to satisfy ourselves, that we have truly controlled the emissions that we're generating, but also the regulatory environment and NGOs. This is another chart on how emissions vary. So this is CO2 emissions in terms of megawatt hour by what they call balancing authorities, which are just geographies. So the electricity markets have these weird geographies. So this is Bonneville, which I think is in the Northwest. I keep on forgetting what Pace is. These are both actually kind of small, but there's a 5 times difference in emissions between the highest and the lowest regions. So where we have our electric vehicles and when they charge and when they discharge, they're really big difference on its impact on the grid. And if we want to sort of decarbonize the grid, we really need to understand these numbers. And so therefore we kind of have to move from tracking electricity to tracking carbon consumption.
Hey, Rob, can we go back? There's a question on the slide before, 18, on just the units of the emissions here. These what people would call marginal emissions? Or are they the total emissions?
These are the metric tons of CO2 per hour.
In that particular hour. Yeah.
Yes.
Total emissions. Okay.
Yeah, total. So it's like here it's is that at midnight, for all of them, it's about 8,000 metric tons. Okay. And then middle of the afternoon, and this is because of solar. This is the famous Duct curve. Solar comes in during the day, and so the fossil fuel generation ramps down. And here we see on whatever the heck day this purple day was, this is, I guess, November 20th, 2020. It's half that. And if you look up at this peak, and this is July, so this is air conditioning up here, coming in the evening. This is, probably 14. It was about 14,000 metric tons a day. So a difference of about 3 for that day from top to bottom, 4 from the lowest here. Okay. Already? Okay. I'm not going to belabor this chart. This is a tracking system that we're putting together with a company we're working for called Timber Rock. It's kind of a spicy little software, energy software company, in which we're now going to track at a 15-minute interval how the emissions coming out of the grid, and with precise matching it to exactly when EVs are charging and where they're charging. So we'll know for every individual charging event, and this is true now across all the, not just charging, but for all our EVSEs and all our equipment, what the contribution is to emissions. Okay, so we'll know whether or not a vehicle is up here, or down here, or here, or here. Right. One more idea before I sort of go on to sort of what this means for General Motors. This chart, and apologize, it's a little complicated, but what this chart is, it sort of reflects the Duct curve chart I showed a few charts ago, and it shows power demand by time of day. So in this profile, which is kind of typical, sort of a 2-hump profile, the power is low in the early parts of the day, comes up in the morning, goes down in the afternoon when solar comes up, goes up again in the evening when air conditioning comes on and solar goes away, and then comes down over the course of the evening. You've probably heard the term base load, and that's for sort of this amount down here. And it's about 40% of the energy consumed. It's what always has to be on. And this is usually nuke or hydro and sometimes cold. These are plants that are really big. They're very costly to build, but the generation is really, really inexpensive. On the other hand, you have peak load, the load used to satisfy consumption here and here. And that tends to be right now overwhelmingly combined cycle natural gas, occasionally light oil, also about 40% of the energy. And by the way, I just noticed my numbers do not add up to 100%, so nobody needs to raise that with me. These are the most smallest and the expensive, and also by far the highest greenhouse gas emitters. And base load, for the most part, is the lowest greenhouse gas emitters. In the middle, we have intermediate load, and that's really where wind and solar come in, about 30% of the energy, and also coal in here. And this is, because it's coal mix, in here, it's not all, the wind and solar has very, very low greenhouse gas, but coal is also part of this. Okay, so that's kind of the intermediate level. Okay, well, what you can do with electric vehicles when you have the ability to discharge into the grid is you can charge it at night when it's at base load, when the grid is at its very greenest, and then discharge it at the peak periods when it is the most, has the highest greenhouse gas emissions and is the most expensive. And this is a source of major value both to the customer and to the grid and to society as a whole. So using sort of average values, the net CO2 averted per vehicle on this, say in the 2030 timeframe, would be about 4 tons of CO2. To put that in scale, that is about as much as the average vehicle generates today from gasoline. Okay. It's very, very close. So it's a tremendous ability that nobody has seen yet, but it's clearly very possible, and people are planning for it, to sort of green our society just by controlling when we charge, combined with the ability to discharge. Okay. All right. I want to take some time to talk about how GM manages its business and the implications of this for what we do. For one thing, it's led us into having new partners that we have not had before. So if you want to have a comprehensive net zero solution, you have to change really who you're working with and the nature of those processes and how you work. Shell, so Shell's an interesting company. They supply all GM's renewable energy. They are, in our minds, truly sort of genuine about becoming an oil and gas producer to becoming an energy producer and making the energy transition. And it's interesting the sort of the shifts that they're having in parallel what GM is doing, because it's a huge shift. It's a huge shift for them. And so we're kind of working with them, as I mentioned, in a couple ways to create innovative sort of green programs that take advantage of each other's customers. And it's interesting because it's a stress and it's a stretch because everybody has to do things differently. Our internal processes are not really set up to do this. And also, frankly, large corporations that have deep history typically don't partner well. Everybody's either a supplier, a customer, or a competitor. So a lot of the reflexes are wrong, but we're kind of making it happen and doing it with others as well. I don't want to say anything against our own. Just in the oil companies, what's pretty clear to us is that the European majors are much more serious about the energy transition than the US energy majors, unfortunately. Okay. Now, manufacturing and sales are also going to change, are changing in a real major way. So on the left, you see sort of a traditional factory where I think those are powertrains being assembled, as you see with people along a line. Here is what the EV propulsion system looks like, okay? And this was in partnership with LG Chem. A number of things to notice is that it's far fewer people. And it's a totally different set of processes, and it's much more complex. And while GM's been producing powertrains for more than 100 years, it was clear GM needed to do it in partnership with LG to produce electric propulsion systems with quality. And every other OEM has found that to be true as well. Okay. And this has had big impact on our engineering organization and will have an impact on our labor force. It's been managed in a really, pretty well, pretty good way with a lot of protection. Everybody gets it, and the idea is to manage this properly. Something similar is going to happen with dealers, and we're going through this right now. So most profitability in auto dealers comes from actually used cars and service. It doesn't come from new car sales. Well, the neat thing about electric vehicles for customers is they require almost no service, no oil changes, transmission. The the propulsion system just usually will last much longer than an ICE system. And when it does go wrong, what you do about it is very, very different. There are far fewer moving parts. So there's going to be far less service. And we're working really closely with our dealers in order to help them manage this transition over the last 5 years. The good part is the transition is not going to be abrupt. It will phase in over the next 5, 6, or 7 years. But it's something that is absolutely has to be managed well and properly and respectfully.
Probably ask a question from the audience on, I think the slide on Shell, I think it's the one before here, and the partnerships there. There's a question about plans. Maybe this is Texas specific question about what they call their MP2 plan, which I guess is Shell's retail electric provider. There are differences in how you're interacting on the retail versus, I don't know, wholesale side here. Maybe that's a question.
So this is reacting on this. So thank you. It's a good question. Sophisticated question from whoever asked it. The Shell acquired MP2 a year or two ago in order to get into the retail electricity business. Texas is, I don't know if you might be scattered. I don't know if you guys are all scattered all over the country or you're all in Texas, but Texas requires that you buy electricity not from the energy generator, but from a retail energy provider, and there are quite a few. If you want to see something interesting, go on the Power to Choose site, and it really looks like the wild west for what's offered. So Shell acquired MP2 in order to go into retail. Okay, and it's one reason it's sort of a fruitful partnership is they can help move into retail. We can help them move into retail, and it's why we can offer our customers a great deal and a green great deal. So that's the short answer. And Shell's still learning about what it means to be in retail. Retail for electricity is kind of weird because nobody cares about electricity. But at one time, nobody cared about a cup of coffee either. And we know what happened with that story.
Okay, thanks. I'll also point out that wild west appearance of retail providers is in some degree a mirage, as there's two companies that own like 75% of the retail actual companies. So.
That is true, but when you do go on that website and you have to choose, then it is an overwhelming. It is fairly overwhelming.
The customer options for sure. Go ahead. Thanks.
The customer options and the different companies and it's very daunting to many people, I think. All right. So here's a question that I think probably has kept you all up many times, late at night. And that is, what do we mean by a wall charger? Okay. Well, in the auto business, traditionally, it would be what we call an accessory. It's something sold separately from the vehicle. It wouldn't be core to the sale or the ownership experience. It'd be like a floor mat or a luggage rack. And within the company, it would be produced, priced, and marketed by our accessories organization, who have their own margin requirements. And these are the people that do the luggage racks and the bike racks and the whatever that you buy usually sometimes at the dealer or afterwards. Sometimes they're installed by the dealer and sometimes after purchase. Okay. Well, it's hard to appreciate this if you've never lived inside a big, large, complex organization with strong processes and strong budget rules and strong margin requirements for individual business units. Okay. Those things really matter. Now, for electric vehicles, these are absolutely critical to the ownership experience. It's the mechanisms that controls how the vehicle interacts with the grid. It enables vehicle-to-grid connection, and it unlocks a huge amount of customer value. It is, in that sense, now completely integral to the customer experience, even though it is totally outside the vehicle. Okay. It's also, by the way, a pathway for competitors to attack GM. Okay. So who in the organization should be in charge of accessories? Who should run it? Okay. Well, the accessories folks, they're saying, well, it should be us because we're going to sell a lot of them. And I mean, literally it goes up to the CEO to make the call that, no, that's not how we're going to do it. And so in fact, GM is now launched. I don't know if I just chose the name. I'm sorry, it's kind of a goofy name. It's Ultify or whatever it is. That is sort of a branded charging experience because it is so core and central and be managed by the same organization that manages the vehicles. Okay, 2 more slides, then we can completely open it up to question. So if you want to capture the value from vehicle to grid, and if you really want to capture the value from electrification, you have to manage across these 3 big parts. One is the vehicle itself along with the EVSE. What happens inside it, its control systems, its human-machine interface, the relationship with OnStars, its control modules, okay? That deeply impacts the user experience, and GM has OnStars and our competitors have similar kinds of things, some of them. And with the mobile web is going to be increasingly important. There will be energy servers up here, okay? These then interact with the grid, okay, and the utility or energy provider. And these all interact with each other in ways that was never true in the past with internal combustion engine, okay? Now, the user experience is the center of it. Any proper sort of sensible way of thinking about the business would put the customer smack at the center. Okay. But how we interact with the grid, so the grid, people in the General Motors who now interact with the grid are almost all in manufacturing, who do, you know, because our factories have these huge electrical loads, so they're always negotiating with utilities for how to get the best load. And they've been also now leading the sustainability of our operations. Well, that's not enough anymore. Now there are people inside who manage the user experience and who manage the vehicle. They suddenly need to understand what the hell a megawatt is, okay? And what time of use pricing is, and why there are 3,000 utilities, and you know, what are these crazy prices and why they matter. So it's a huge management challenge in which the organization is now struggling with, okay, how do we do this? How do we manage this as a systemic whole instead of within the silos, which kind of working, you know, when it was internal combustion engines. Okay.
There's a question relevant to this slide. It's kind of,
yes.
You're talking about this user experience and GM wanting to essentially, I guess, be a part of that and provides hardware and software. So how do you view provision of hardware and software for this vehicle to grid experience with other cars of other companies? How are you thinking about that? I guess this gets into standards and these kinds of things, but
you've hit on one thing that's really important, and that is standards. So if you are going to be able to export to the grid, the regulatory environment has to permit it. In order for that to happen, there have to be standards that everybody agrees to. And without that, nothing's going to happen. And there has to be a regulatory environment, in addition to the sort of the standards and the technology. There have to be the standards that enable it. They're going to have to be common across the OEMs, the automotive, all the automotive manufacturers. Okay. Understanding that has to actually probably push back all the way back into the vehicle and what controls are on the vehicle, as well as in the mobile access. There is some debate about other OEMs and how much one OEM needs to work with another. We think that it's really important to cooperate. So GM is in this consortium called OVGIP. The vehicle grid interaction part is the middle. We can never remember what O and P means, so sorry about that. And this is with Ford, Honda, and one other, I think Nissan. and others are joined, and we are then collectively working with utilities to participate in demand response programs for our customers. And the OVGIP entity will develop sort of this common aggregator function that will link back to the OEMs. Okay. Did I answer that question adequately, Carrie? Do you want me to, if it was unclear, then?
I think that was okay. Yeah, it was just a question about standards and, do you expect there to be, I guess, in some sense, a market to, somebody asked the question, if I have a car of GM on my garage and I have another electric car of some other company, you're going to be able to use the GM or some other company's user experience interaction with both cars, right? Or do you need two different ones? Yeah.
So the charging is increasingly going to the standard CCS, which is different than Tesla's, or the European standard, which is CHAdeMO. But charging, for the most part, which will be probably the most important, will be common across all the OEMs. But it's still a battle what's being fought. Okay. So who is going after these opportunities? Everyone. And this is a listing of who are sort of seriously playing in home energy services and electrification. Well, the obvious ones are the auto OEMs, and each of these have major initiatives in place. VW's, Tesla, everybody knows about. VW started its own energy company. Toyota, in its quiet way, is moving very aggressively into it. Honda, Daimler, BMW, and so forth. The charge point operators, or the charging hardware companies, see a major role for them. And indeed it is. The charging software and service folks are thinking, we can get in the middle of this, and maybe we can control the flow of energy and be able to collect tolls. The utilities definitely think they're players and believe they have a right to control this and sort of argue about who gets the slices of the pie. Renewable companies, then the big interesting ones are the internet players, and Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, Baidu, Tencent. You've probably seen some of the articles about Apple producing a car, and Google obviously very interested in it. Well, it's not clear how much they want to go into it. And then there's this whole piece about what they call DERMS, Distributed Energy Resource Management Systems. And here's the list of them. And that's going to be the software hardware interface between the vehicles and the grid. It's going to be really important. And so there are all these competitive threats that are all coming from different places that we didn't anticipate in the past. And so it's like, oh my gosh, now we got to worry about Nextera, and what do they want? So and Apple and Google are, to say the least, immensely formidable companies, and certainly they could buy GM out of pocket change, and if they decide to enter the business, it would be something that would really matter. All right, last slide. The point of this is that the whole game is changing. And in one sense, the old world might have been viewed this way, where everybody kind of knew their swim lanes and you would stay more or less within your swim lanes, and you want to swim as fast as you can, back and forth racing the other guys. Well, it's much, much more like a basketball game, and I'm not even sure what that metaphor is, because yeah, sure, people have assigned roles and parts, but it's immensely fluid, dynamic, conflictual contest where you might be asked to do all sorts of different things at different times. And I was thinking of putting up a picture here of a knife fight, but decided not to do that. And we're all still figuring out the rules. We don't know. The truth is, the more people study it, the more they understand it, the more they realize that we really are heading into a world that's fascinating and exciting and challenging, but we don't know what it looks like. And that's it.
All right. Thank you, Rob. Thanks for that great presentation. There's at least a couple questions on the list that I'll get to, and then maybe there will be more. Yeah, basketball and sports, they obviously keep changing the rules. We added a 3-point line. You can either have a zone defense or not have a zone defense. Right? There's all kinds of stuff. Right?
No, exactly. It's a much better, like, whereas the rules for how to do a relay race, they haven't changed for a very long time, right?
Yeah. Okay. So I just go back to sort of one of the questions, and I was thinking in my head that was about just your, power purchase agreements, but this gets a little bit more in terms of going renewable energy, but a little bit more about grid management. And the question that was about distributed or owning solar or storage locally versus just purchasing, say, renewable energy from the grid. And maybe it's relevant for EVs because it is a bit more about, let's just say, minimizing the peak flow of power into a city or something like this. And some studies, looking into this, I think there's a recent one by Vibrant Clean Energy that claims, yes, if you really want to manage the grid, renewable low carbon grid properly, you would have a lot more storage so that you minimize investment in the distribution grid itself.
Correct.
And so EVs can play a role there. So how much, is there anything more you can say about thinking about
I think it play an
minimizing distribution investments because of local?
So it can have a huge role in minimizing, well, there's transmission and distribution, which are the wires that transport the energy from the generator out into the houses. In all cases, that's probably going to need upgrade. And there's a lot of work in the Biden administration to do that. Electrification might defer some needs for that. It might cause local problems at the far end where it's suddenly on small nodes, there's more load than anticipated. That's going to happen over time. It will not be a big problem, I don't think. But EVs are just mobile batteries. And the capacity in the EV fleet is going to be tremendous relative to the energy that's needed. I once did a calculation, probably the spare energy in just GM's fleet will be equal to something like 40% of the civilian nuclear load, okay, base load. One car will hold about 100 kilowatt hours of energy, okay? It will consume on the order of 10 kilowatts. It might consume 10% of the electricity in the vehicle a day, leaving 80% of its energy to be used to either shift consumption or reduce the need to add capacity if you manage it correctly. And the numbers are really large and it will really matter. So yes, it's going to be an incredibly important source of greening the grid. And we don't know the extent, we don't know exactly what has to happen to manage it, but yeah, it's going to be a really big deal. And certainly just to put one more sort of carp in it, we produce, I think average household consumes about 30 kilowatt hours a day for the average household. Probably not too many of us live in that, but average house, 30 kilowatt hours a day, which means your EV could power your house for 2 or 3 days with your spare capacity, okay? And it could supply all the energy used during peak hours, no problem, then have leftover to sell back to the grid, okay? So yes, it will absolutely matter.
Right, thanks. There's a question about sort of renters versus homeowners here, but I think it opens up maybe a little bit bigger question. And I think you maybe alluded to it in one of the earlier slides and just talking about the culture at GM and the age demographics of people that work at GM now, if they're getting much younger than they used to be. So, to me, it opens up a broader question. What is the role for cars and light trucks in the future of mobility versus mobility not in that? So you're doing a lot about vehicle to grid and you're betting a lot on electrification, but how do we think about, or how does GM think about other forms of mobility, which could still be electrified, buses and little scooters and who knows what, bikes, but do you still see the same amount of mobility through cars and trucks going on in the future? And let's just say at least the US.
It's a really good question. I'm not the world's greatest expert on it. Obviously micro-mobility, which is this whole, with scooters in its various forms in cities, are going to be really important. There are obviously challenges to it. If you've ever tried to walk down San Francisco and not get run over by somebody zipping along in their little scooter at enough speed to make them an organ donor if they crash. So that there are definite challenges, but micromobility is here to stay. GM had a foray into it with e-bikes. It was frankly not very well conceived, but we see it happening now. Whether or not General Motors, participates in that, we're thinking it's being considered. One thing that GM is doing is just introduced a new line called Bright Drop, which is designed for freight delivery in dense urban areas using electric vehicles with sort of autonomous robots. So it's which is a really important part of reducing congestion in cities. We see that as a huge area of interest where GM can play. We just made a very big bet that will be important. But as for what it will be the final mix between micro-mobility and vehicles and their different sizes and autonomous and driven, I think we're going to have to get a little bit closer to know what the right answer is.
Yeah, maybe a follow-up on your big bet there, which gets to the question about, if you're not a single family residential home, is the big bet something about GM owning vehicles that are autonomous and then, provide rides to people and owning those vehicles yourself, and how does the partnership with Shell or some other company charging? Yeah.
GM's invested very heavily in Cruise, and by that I mean billions of dollars, along with others now, to develop sort of fully autonomous vehicles. And the first ones just will come out for sort of driverless taxi applications, and I don't know when. I think we've announced it. I probably don't even know the right date anyway. But we definitely see personally owned autonomous vehicles being a huge part of driving. Every time we test it, people love it in concept. Who would not want a car that drives itself, right? You go to a room, it's 10,000 people and say, how many of you do not want a car that will just come and you sit back and you read, you sleep, you go to work and you don't have to pay attention to it. You talk to everybody, almost everybody wants that. There are people that love to drive that don't want that, but for the most part, everybody wants that. When we'll get to it technically and safely is the question. It's obviously taken longer than people anticipated it would. So there were some overly optimistic predictions a few years ago. I refer back to my earlier Bill Gates quote. But sometime towards the end of this decade, 25, 26, 30, sometime in that, we will have personally owned autonomous vehicles that are affordable and safe and widely out there for private use.
Right. So up in the air in terms of GM on whether you'd want to be a taxi company of autonomous vehicles?
We do not. GM has invested heavily in a taxi company, and I personally and other people have like Microsoft and Honda and other big players. So we see that as being a major product. But I think the big play will be privately owned autonomous vehicles.
Right. Okay. Well, I think that wraps up our questions that are on here. So everyone watching, thank you for submitting these good questions. And thank you again to Rob Kleinbaum, Technical Fellow at General Motors. I think it was a very enlightening talk, some nice slides and some nice overviews of the strategy of GM. So hopefully we can continue to talk. And thank you for speaking with us today.
My great pleasure. And thank you all very, very much. I really appreciate the opportunity.